This conversation, the fifth of 2 Centuries of Jacksonville series for 2022, is a production of the Jessie Ball, duPont Fund, and the Jaxson magazine, launched by Modern Cities in association with WJCT Public Broadcasting. The Jaxson is a multimedia project dedicated to urbanism and culture on Florida's First Coast. This event is also sponsored by the Florida chapter of the American Planning Association's First Coast section and is eligible for 1.5 CM credits for all certified planners in attendance today. My name is Ennis Davis, and I'm a senior planner with Benish and Company, a public historian, vice president of membership and outreach for the Florida chapter of the American Planning Association, and a Florida Trust Historic Preservation trustee and co-founder of online media publications, thejacksonmag.com and moderncities.com. I will be your moderator for today's discussion. Before we dive into today's topic, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Number one, please introduce yourselves in the chat box, and we are working on that. Actually, I think we got that fixed now. It's number two, this session will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants next week. So in addition, a follow-up survey to all participants will be sent out next week as well. Also, we have Melanie Koss and Colin Mullis from the duPont Fund, and they are available for tech support in the event that we need it. So please use the chat function for any troubleshooting requests as well. And then last, we have time reserved for Q&A after the panelists share their expertise. So please use the Q&A function in your Zoom controls to add questions at any time during our conversation. So today's topic is going to focus on movement and migration in Jacksonville and the First Coast. And with that said, I have two guests, two people who I respect very deeply join us today as panelists, Kentrice Jones and Andrew Patanzi. So what I'm going to do at this time is just, to allow them to go ahead and introduce themselves personally. So Kentrice, I'll start with you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Ennis. My name is Kentrice Jones. I am the president and owner of a company called Acuity Design Group. We do a lot of PR communications for transit and transportation in the area. We've been in business for almost 15 years. March 1st will be 15 years. So we've been excited to do the work that we do. I personally am very involved with all things downtown Jacksonville, all things Jacksonville, and connecting communities in ways that typically haven't been connected, and just the idea of the fact that that needs to happen. So thanks for having me.
Thank you, Kentrice. Andrew, I'll give you the floor.
Hi, my name's Andrew Pantazzi. I'm a Jacksonville native from the South Side, and I'm the editor of a nonprofit news organization called The Tributary. And we've spent much of the last year looking into demographics as it relates to redistricting, and I'm really excited to join this important conversation about the role of transportation in shaping Jacksonville, where we are today and where we're going in the future.
Thank you, Andrew. And again, I'm honored to have both of you here today. So we hope that all participants on this call will leave today's session with a better understanding of the following learning objectives. Number one, what does the term infrastructure really include? Number two, who is in charge of what and how does funding work? Number three, what types of infrastructure best meets the needs of our community, and how has that changed over time? Number four, I guess, is what are the unintended consequences of transportation infrastructure development and the impact of the patterns on our community's movement? And then the last learned objective we would like to take away from this session is letting panelists know how the community can get more involved on these conversations and projects. So at this time, I'm going to share my screen and go through a brief historical narrative on movement and migration in Jacksonville. So there's a reason that Jacksonville is known as a gateway city. Since the founding of our city, transportation has shaped our city, our neighborhoods, our economy, and our mobility. So to get started, let's define that term infrastructure. Infrastructure can be defined as the basic physical and organizational structures and facilities needed for operation of a society or enterprise. That's a lot to say there, right? In terms of transportation, infrastructure means all highways, roads, bike paths, sidewalks, airports, rail lines, docking facilities, as well as a number of transportation and transit facilities. A brief walk through our past can illustrate how Jacksonville's built environment and culture has continuously been shaped through transportation infrastructure development. During the Civil War, steamboats were a dominant part of our region's transportation network. So dominant that in 1860, Jacksonville, St. Augustine, Fernandina, and Palatka were all cities that were similar in size. Following the war, things rapidly changed when Jacksonville became a major railroad center. As a result, by 1890, Jacksonville had easily emerged as the region's major urban center as the steamboat era went to a close. That same year, the region's first bridge across the St. Johns forever changed the face of Florida's East Coast. This transformation is reflected today in Miami being the 9th largest metropolitan area in the country, with more than 6.1 million people and home to one of the country's first modern high-speed rail projects, as well as one of the country's largest urban skylines. At the local level, there was also an impact. The Jacksonville terminal, which was constructed by Henry Flagler, became the largest passenger railroad terminal in the country south of Washington, D.C. That critical mass of activity led to La Villa being a primary entry point in the city for several early immigrant communities. For example, Railroad Row, a busy district along West Bay Street, emerged as an early epicenter for the city's Greek community. The terminal also stimulated a market for a red light district that contained 60 bordellos along a 4-block stretch of Houston Street, 2 blocks north of the railroad terminal. This was a place that temperance movement leader Carrie Nation declared a demonocracy during her visit to town in 1908. This critical mass of activity around the railroad station also led to a fusion of Black cultures from around the South, resulting in La Villa being an early epicenter for ragtime, jazz, and blues. Also a major center of employment, the terminal was fused into Jacksonville's culture. For example, the city's Negro League baseball team, the Jacksonville Redcaps, were named in honor of the red cap wearing Pullman porters who worked at the train station. That fusion of activity also resulted in a national movement such as the Great Migration. You know, over time, we've forgotten that a poem that went viral out of Jacksonville led to a demographic shift in the country that birthed districts like Detroit's Black Bottom, Chicago's Bronzeville, New York's Harlem, and DC's U Street throughout cities in the North and the Midwest. Following World War II, infrastructure investments in our roadway network resulted in a different pattern of migration and development. For example, when the Arlington Bridge opened in 1953, a majority of Duval County residents lived in the city of Jacksonville, which was then 30 square miles at the time. Within 10 years, Jacksonville had fallen into a population decline, while suburban growth mushroomed in unincorporated areas of Duval County. Those shifts created a new market for suburban commerce, spurring large shopping centers and malls, such as Regency Square shown here, as well as Gateway, Normandy, Phillips, and Roosevelt malls, on all areas located outside of downtown. An unintended consequence of this development pattern that we are experiencing today is we have a number of historic rural communities such as Cosmo in the Fort Caroline area that are now overwhelmed and engulfed by suburban sprawl, and their sense of place is dramatically changing. This expressway system that was constructed was also intentionally used during the 50s and 60s as a form of urban renewal, destroying the landscape, quality of life, and health of residents in neighborhoods like La Villa, the East Side, Brooklyn, Sugar Hill, Moncrief, and North Riverside. However, an unintended consequence of those actions was the economic decline of downtown in the second half of the 20th century. And not only did it impact downtown, it also impacted several older neighborhood commercial districts throughout the urban core as traffic was diverted from these established commercial corridors. One final example to get us started would be the Port of Jacksonville. Prior to World War II, port activity was primarily concentrated along the riverfront and was centered along Bay Street in the heart of downtown. The result was a riverfront filled with 24/7 activity, seafood markets, retail, wholesale, and maritime related businesses. However, in the second half of the 20th century, changes in shipping, including containerization, trucking, resulted in the port and logistic activity largely located outside of downtown, taking thousands of jobs with these locations as they spread out along the riverfront and along rail yards outside the urban core. The unintended consequence of those changes has been a riverfront that has remained largely underutilized despite 7 continuous decades of various redevelopment plans and strategies. So without a doubt, our neighborhoods, our economy, and our mobility have been shaped through our transportation infrastructure investments. In our current and future infrastructure projects, which include additional highway widenings, new river crossings, JTA's ultimate urban circulator in the downtown area, and even high-speed intercity rail such as Brightline, which could really impact the way the region interconnects with the rest of the state, will likely shape our community in ways that we can't even imagine today. So with that said, I want to just run through that real quick to kind of set the pace and pattern for today's discussion on movement and migration. And I want to go ahead and get Cantrice and Andrew involved in this discussion. So Cantrice, I want to start off with you. I have a general question for you. You are a woman who is working in a traditionally male-dominated industry, the transportation industry. Can you share a little bit of how you got into the industry, what your company specializes in, and your general thoughts on Jacksonville's transportation network, as well as how people here can get more involved with these projects?
Absolutely. So, gosh, how I started was several years ago. Right out of college, I worked for a local planning and engineering firm, and they had a lot of transportation projects that they were currently working on. So, of course, I got heavily involved in those, and I am one who is very inquisitive. And so it just allowed me to learn even more and expand a little bit outside of what I expected to do when I was working at that company. And so years later, I guess maybe about, 12 years later, I decided to go out on my own and start a consulting firm. I mentioned earlier, it's called ADG, Acuity Design Group. And we just automatically started working with transit and transportation agencies here locally. We are certified. We have a lot of certifications that have allowed us and opened quite a few doors for us. And you mentioned male dominated. And I guess, I'm one of those people who likes a challenge. So I decided to go that route because there weren't very many females working in this industry. So my degree from college is in communications and marketing. And so typically a lot of communications and marketing folks go a completely different route than what I went. And so I found a niche and I found an opportunity for us to grow a successful business working in the transit and transportation and planning area. So currently we are working on 3 pretty cool projects, or more than 3, but maybe I'll say 4 projects that you guys may be very interested in. One of the biggest projects that we're just launching is the City of Jacksonville transportation planning effort. There is a website, and I'll share that with you. It's ventureoutjax.com. And so we're looking at all of the areas within Jacksonville. You can go to the website. There's a map where you can drop a pin and talk about your concerns, whether it's an infrastructure concern, a safety concern, a flooding concern, a crossing concern, bicycle and pedestrian safety. One of the things that we're big on here, or unfortunately, is we have a high level of pedestrian fatalities on a regular basis. And so, we're a very car-centric city, and we need to kind of take a step back and look at how we can improve transit and mobility and transportation for everyone, no matter what mode of transportation you choose to use. And so the second project I'll mention, when you talk a little bit about commuter rail, we are working with JTA on their First Coast Commuter Rail project. It's a TOD study. Nothing has been confirmed as of yet. It's truly a study identifying the potential of having commuter rail that goes from JRTC, which is the Jacksonville Regional Transportation Center, down to St. Augustine. So we're currently studying that. And then the other thing that was very interesting to me that you mentioned, when it comes down to the division of communities, we're talking about we're also working with JTA on a TOD Green Line study. That's their bus rapid transit line that goes from JRTC out to Armsdale Road. There has not been much development, not much construction or growth in that area. Looking at Gateway Mall as a potential opportunity to have some level of connectivity to the community, whether it's creating a space for workforce development centers to encourage career training or what have you. So we're currently asking people what they want to see happening along that corridor. And the last project that I'll mention is the U2C project. It's the Ultimate Urban Circulator, the Bay Street Innovation Corridor. That's an entirely different mode of transportation to move people. Not something that many of us know about. We're all learning about the potential of how that's going to work. So we're having community meetings. We have a community meeting on Thursday regarding that. And so just overall, I think it's so important for us to realize that connectivity, because we're such a big city, connectivity is always going to be a little bit of a challenge. But if we offer opportunities in diverse ways to allow people to connect with each other, or even to connect to downtown, a lot of big cities that are around us have very busy, booming, active downtowns. And so we're really encouraged and hoping that some of the efforts that are happening now will encourage that. So hopefully I've answered your question, Ennis.
You did. You actually said a lot more. And so definitely appreciate that. I even have my own questions on some of these projects, but we'll hold those for now. Okay. So anyone who is in the chat, if you do have any questions that you have that may pop up as we're going and talking and chatting back and forth here, please use the Q&A function to drop those in, and we will get to those as soon as possible during our Q&A session. So at this time, Andrea, I want to ask you a question regarding the continued demographic shifts. Historically, infrastructure has played a major role in our built environment in ways that we can't even imagine. So I wanted to get your perspective on just the patterns of our community movement and any potential unintended consequences within that infrastructure network that you've seen from your work at the Tributary.
Yeah, so I think, the most obvious thing that we've seen has been the explosion of population in our suburban areas. St. Johns County has been one of the fastest growing counties in Florida and one of the fastest growing in the country over the last 2 decades, consistently year over year. They've more than doubled in size in just the last 20 years. increasing by 122%. And so that's, shows just how much it has become a big issue for our, neighbors to the south. And you see this happen just with the sales tax vote that they had recently, where they voted down overwhelmingly an infrastructure tax because it was seen as code for more development. And so you're starting to see there a push against development, but that's also changed Duval, where now we are seeing more and more development in what used to be forested area on the southeast part of the county, where we're getting more land, more development. And we saw this with a taxing district we created in Bay Meadows because some of the infrastructure was not keeping up with the issues that were being faced in these newer neighborhoods that weren't connected in the same way. And so we're seeing a lot of that on the borders. We're also seeing it in Clay and Nassau. Clay and Nassau also have grown significantly over the last 2 decades. Both have grown about 55 to 60% in just the last 2 decades, which is really, really fast compared to Duval, which is growing, but not nearly to that degree. And so we're seeing more and more how we have to deal with having these, these bedroom communities outside of our borders. I mean, you see this with the discussions of potential for putting in a train going into St. Augustine to Jacksonville. And it makes it, create new challenges with building new roads. I remember when I was in community college and, 9A's expansion, which now it's 295, was continuing further and further south to connect more of those communities. And we saw new communities in Nocatee being developed at that time on both sides of Duval and St. John's border. And so those new roads, I mean, that's oftentimes cutting through areas that either, in some cases, there were already places there, or there was nothing except forest there, and the impacts that has environmentally when we are developing those areas. And we're doing it in such a, as you mentioned, in a sprawling way, where we're not doing it in a high density sort of fashion. I don't know if you wanted me to get into more of kind of what you'd asked me to talk about Ennis at this time, or if you wanted to bring that up later, but I can also share some of the, the maps that I've worked on that show some of the interplay between the infrastructure and the population in Jacksonville.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to jump in and show some of the maps. I think it would be very interesting for our viewers.
Yeah, let me load that. I apologize to anyone if my computer has been giving me a lot of issues today, so hopefully this all goes according to plan. But is this showing up for everybody?
It is.
Okay, perfect. So just to start off with some of the basics on where Duval is today, for the first time in 2020, Duval County became majority non-white. A majority of respondents to the census identified as something other than white. And we see, continue going back to, post-Civil War and Reconstruction, the importance of the Black population in Jacksonville. And while the white population is declining as a share of the overall population, the Black population has been remaining stable. And it's at about 32% of people identify as Black, whether that's only Black or Black and something else. And to put this in context for people, the city of Jacksonville, it's a little bit higher, it's 33%. But people are often shocked when I share with them that among the 15 most populous cities in the US, Jacksonville has the second largest Black population. That means we have a larger Black population than Chicago or New York. The only one of the major cities in the US with a larger share of Black residents is Philadelphia. And this goes to show how important the racial dynamic is in Jacksonville, but also how often we tend to overlook, I think, the lack of political power that Black residents have had in Jacksonville compared to many of the other cities on this list. And when we talk about infrastructure and transportation needs, the lack of a say in the actual process when it comes to where roads are being built or what needs are being met, in particular in Jacksonville, despite making up more than a third of the city's population. And then this is a map of the city of Jacksonville with everyone identified according to how they identified it with the 2020 census down to the census block level. And so you see the persistent segregation where the green dots represent Black residents, the blue dots represent white residents, purple and orange represent Asian and Hispanic residents. And you see how much just on a macro level zoomed out, you can identify I-10's dividing line. You can identify where, the bridges have, cut off Riverside from Brooklyn and downtown, and the separation between different communities that happens with the roads. And kind of zooming in further, you can really see the stark contrast, even when you move between Riverside and Murray Hill with Roosevelt, or Riverside and Mixontown, or you can see Lackawanna and the importance of the interstates in cutting through neighborhoods and cutting off neighborhoods. And we're seeing population growth in Brooklyn. It's mostly white population growth, but that was a very historic Black neighborhood that was cut off on both sides by bridges going through and by the interstates. And it dwindled from having thousands of people in the middle of the century to having, in the 2010 census, only about 50 people remaining in the neighborhood. And so what used to be a really densely populated, important Black neighborhood in our community dwindled away. And then with the new development that's coming in, the changing demographics of the neighborhood. And so again, I think that's another example of when it comes to planning, the neighbors at the time spoke often about how little input they were getting into some of the planning that was happening, and how much they felt like they were not getting much of a say in what was going to change in their neighborhood. I mean, I did throw up a link if people want to just see this map that I put together, and if they want to explore it themselves. But you can kind of go all over the city and see different roads. The Arlington Expressway is another one that have cut through neighborhoods and been really important dividing lines in the city of Jacksonville. And we also see this play out in the redistricting process, where this is the old map that was thrown out by a federal court. But oftentimes in redistricting, you're using those same roads that can be dividing lines between neighborhoods and dividing along racial lines used in drawing district lines as well. And so you can see some of the same segregating practices perpetuated because of the importance of these roads that cut through neighborhoods, whether it's, again, Sugar Hill or Mixontown or any number of neighborhoods that have been divided from like communities. So that was just the quick overview I had that Ennis had asked me to kind of share. But I'd love to hear if people can chime in the chat as well, just some of the examples in your neighborhoods of roads that you've noticed the way that they've impacted. I talked a lot about roads, but the other important thing historically has been the importance of railroads as well, even within communities. I live off of Powers, right where it becomes Old Kings, and I live with my neighborhood going up to the railroad tracks. And when you look at the census blocks, our side of Old Kings, closer to the railroad tracks, is very different than the demographics on the other side of Old Kings. And so you can often see how railroads, and especially the importance of the noise and the pollution and the negative neighborhood impacts, and how that has reduced home values and often created even mini segregation within neighborhoods of who lives closer to the railroad tracks and who lives further away from the railroad tracks. I think that perpetuates as well whichever side of the river you're on, if you follow the railroad tracks, and who often is living closest to them, which I think you'll also see if you look at the link that I was sharing.
It was a great presentation. I really love those maps, especially as an urban planner. And just think about things from the historical perspective. We have our infrastructure, which is, one form of government investment, but then we also have our laws and policies that also have an impact. So when that infrastructure is layered with, say, zoning practices, for example, you really get a true understanding of what across the tracks means. Because back in the older days, when we had our first zoning policy implemented in the city back in 1929, many of the minority communities were forced to be on certain parts, other sides of the railroad track. Infrastructure, again, was used as a dividing line between communities. So as we layer that with policies, after policies from the GI Bill to rail on in the 1930s, you carry that all the way out to where we're at today. Even an investment of where we put in public housing, that adds up to some neighborhoods being the haves, and those that have nots in terms of economic influence as well as economic opportunity. So I'm going to jump into the questions in the chat box at this point in time. And also, if you have not asked a question yet, feel free to drop those in, and we will try to get to all of them. So the first question here, and Kentrice, I guess you can start off with this one because this is one of your projects you mentioned. But it is a question that's asking for our opinions on the U2C versus the maintenance and expansion of monorail and train-based transport. The comment says it seems like the U2C will be just public taxis that add more road-based traffic.
So let's see, what are the opinions? Well, if you want my opinion, I think it's a great idea. I think it's a great opportunity for us to be a little bit different in the way that we connect people. I think that it is going to be, we're very early on in the project. And so, final things aren't quite done yet. And we're going through testing vehicles and understanding exactly how we're going to take the vehicles from the elevated platform to at grade. So, it's going to be challenging. It's going to be different. And a lot of times people don't like change or don't want to see anything change. So, because I'm working on the project, of course, I think it's a great idea. I just think we have to make sure that we're careful, we're cautious, we understand the safety precautions, we understand the dangers, and we understand what this service is actually doing and providing for people. So looks like something else popped in the chat. So that's my opinion. My opinion is that it's a great opportunity for the city. I think it'll set us apart from a lot of different cities. And I do think that other cities will follow suit. I think that we have a transit agency that is beyond a transit agency here in Jacksonville, with working with the Jacksonville Transportation Authority. Many transit agencies have not stepped into the realm of doing the things that JTA is doing. So I think it's a pretty cool opportunity for the city as a whole. So my opinion is, I think it's a great idea. We just got to make sure we do it right.
Thank you. Andrew, did you have any opinions on that? On the U2C?
Well, I was hoping that you were going to weigh in, Ennis. I'd love, because I know you've written so much about the Skyway for decades now. I'd love to hear you weigh in on the Skyway and JTA's plan right now with the urban circulator, which maybe for people who aren't familiar with the terminology, this is the autonomous buses that would also be able to ride on the roads as well as go up above ground using much of the Skyway infrastructure. But Ennis, you've written so much about this, and I feel like you have very strong opinions about this. I'd love to hear you.
Sure. You toss me out there like that. Okay. So my background's in transportation planning. Worked on a lot of projects across the state and in the country over the course of my career. And I would say the U2C in general, I kind of view it as more of a first mile, last mile concept, which is great. I think in terms of public transit or just transportation in general, the more diverse in technologies you have and the way you can connect into communities, the better. So for me, I think the bigger importance is no matter whether you're talking about a streetcar, a autonomous vehicle, or a bus, how we tying into the communities that are underserved, how we tying into things from a land use and development perspective. I think that's kind of more important than what the technology may be. I do think that the technology that we're shooting for, it's still fairly new. There's a lot of things outside of our local control that we don't know today. Maybe for example, computers is dumb, right? So it could be like if you were driving down the street and a bird was in the middle of the street, you know common sense that the bird will likely fly away before you get there. A computer might not know that right now. So there's a lot of things that we have to test in the transportation side, the technology side, that things that may not make sense today may make sense 20 or 30 years from now. But in the end, I would say I don't view it as a replacement for fixed transit, if you want to put it that way. It's something that could complement. You take a train, say from St. Augustine to JRTC, and maybe this is a form of a ride share or taxi, if you want to call it that can get you to down the block or down to 3 or 4 blocks away from the train station. So it's something that can supplement the system, but it's something that we would continue to need to add to the system to have more connectivity outside of downtown. That would probably be my general opinion on it.
I mean, I also think it's interesting as a replacement for the Skyway, which similarly at the time of the Skyway's adoption was a brand new kind of untested technology. And it was, Jacksonville, Detroit, and Miami that were kind of the guinea pigs to test whether this is the future of public transit across the country. And it proved not to be in terms of widespread adoption. But, I think there is always a danger in trying to go after something shiny, which is that it is untested. And if it doesn't come completely perfect, which no transportation system does, each one requires a lot more work and a lot more time and a lot more investment than people assume, whether you're doing something that's old and trusted or something new. But I think new ones tend to have higher expectations in some ways that can be damaging to the long-term survivability of the program in some ways. For me, what matters most more than technology or the mode that's used is just the frequency. How long are you waiting? I don't think that the Skyway on its own, as the technology is bad. I think what's bad about the Skyway is, as someone who often cheats in my parking by parking for free in Springfield and then walking down to the Rosa Parks station, is you're waiting forever for the Skyway to come. It's not frequent. And in considering how short a distance it takes you, I can walk that distance. And so for the U2C or for any other transportation, it's about how frequent are you going to actually get the transportation coming to you. And that's why I think buses, just investing in more buses and having more buses that are arriving at bus stops so that you don't have to wait as long, can be one of the most worthwhile investments.
Now, it's interesting because I'm also someone who cheats the way you cheat. I just park down in San Marco and I take the Kings Avenue station into downtown to avoid paying for parking. But with that being said, you mentioned the 1980s program with the Skyway and Miami's People Mover, Detroit's People Mover and Miami's Metro Mover. And interesting note, it's when it comes down to infrastructure, a lot of times it's not so much the technology, as you mentioned, sometimes it's frequency, but it's also land use. So out of all those systems that were experimented with during the 1980s, one has expanded and will be expanded again now to South Beach, which is the Miami Metro Movement. One of the big reasons it tends to work better than the Skyway has worked and Detroit's People Mover in the past is that it's, again, weaving into a larger network of complementary modes of transportation. So you can be in Hialeah or Dadeland and take Metro Rail, which is the heavy rail system, into downtown, easily transfer to Metro Mover, which operates with a high frequency, and it gets you to the spots in downtown. And in addition, the Miami, I think it's Miami 21, which is a comprehensive zoning code rewrite back, it's been 20 years ago now, but it encouraged a lot of TOD, transit-oriented development, around their transit stations. So the Metro Rail system, which was called Metro Fail when I was a kid, has thousands of units of housing, both affordable and market rate and luxury, along those transit stations. And Metro Mover has the same thing. Metro Mover goes through buildings in downtown. So I think, with the U2C and not even U2C, First Coast Commuter Rail, the JTA Flyer, Amtrak, which is something else we haven't talked about, but Amtrak is looking at ways to run intercity rail to better connect Jacksonville with Miami, Orlando, and Tampa, as well as Brightline, which future phase could connect Jacksonville to Tampa, Orlando, Miami as well. All of these, what are we doing with our land use policies to support that transportation infrastructure investments? Land use is largely going to determine the success or failure of a lot of those public transit projects. All right, I'm going to jump back to the chat here and just continue going down to our next question. So this is just a general comment, because I know, Andrew, you had mentioned examples of barriers that people are familiar with in terms of the built environment and just demographic patterns within the city. So this comment just says, I live in Riverside, very close to the US 17 Roosevelt Highway and the interstates. US 17 and the railroad, which is super noisy near me, are barriers to being able to bike and walk to Mixontown, Lackawanna, and Murray Hill safely in a comfortable format, and driving feels more and more unsafe, especially living so close to that I-10 eastbound ramp. That is a pretty good example of how the 1950s and 60s highway system has split those areas. If you took a look at our older red line maps, it's actually interesting to see that the exact location and footprint of Interstate 10 and that Roosevelt ramp from US 17 to Interstate 10 were built in areas that were traditionally redlined minority parts of what was Lackawanna and Murray Hill. So it's very interesting to see that, and it is something that continues to be a barrier. So I think one of the things in looking towards our future in terms of transportation is both of these corridors are nearing their end of life in terms of functionally obsolete. They're 1950s corridors designed with that type of criteria. Now we're in the 21st century. So in the future, there will be projects. Interstate 10 is being redeveloped, reconstructed now. There will be projects to change how those interstates and highways function. Interstate 95 is another one through La Villa. So I think we do, as a community, have an opportunity to coordinate with the Florida Department of Transportation, which has a responsibility, a maintenance responsibility of those highways, to be reparative in a way of trying to alleviate some of the economic and built environment damage that was done when those highways were intentionally built within those environments 70 years ago.
So Ennis, I'm pretty sure you know about the Reconnecting Communities grant that DOT put out. So just to give you an idea of having an understanding that DOT is very aware of how, it divided communities and the economic impact, right? So they did come out with these grant opportunities. And so we helped JTA and as well as the Emerald Trail pull together a grant to help them get additional funding for the Emerald Trail. So we looked at how, I think I texted you the other day about how those communities will be connected through the Emerald Trail. So at least in my mind, people are starting to think through how to go back and improve what they know caused issues in communities. And I think that's a very important aspect for us to think through. And also just from a community perspective, having an understanding of increasing the opportunity for those individuals who are usually under-resourced to have access to certain things. So in a roundabout way, going back to equality and fairness is something that is extremely important. And I think we're close. I think we're far away too. So I think there's a combination of things that allow us to have an understanding of the importance, but I also think that policies and procedures need to be put in place to prevent from happening again.
It's interesting you bring reconnected communities up. I've been in Jacksonville now for about 18 or 19 years, and from the early days of running the Metro Jacksonville blog to Modern Cities to the Jackson, a lot has changed over that time. The conversations we have today now, they were non-existent 10, 15 years ago. So it's been very interesting to be that, but also I had an opportunity to work in-house at the Florida Department of Transportation, District 5, which is down in Central Florida, the past 5 years, just coming out of that. So one of the things that occurred during that period of time was FDOT pretty much changed their entire design manual in terms of how highways and their infrastructure networks are built. Changed in a way that I would say the Florida Department of Transportation is more progressive than a lot of local municipalities across the state in terms of complete streets and context-sensitive streets. The new design manual does impact how highways and FDOT facilities are designed within different built environments. We call them context classifications. But there's also a big initiative statewide within the department to, retrofit a lot of the corridors as the time comes to, resurface or reconstruct, to again be more reparative in ways that these roads are more balanced in terms of their users. So I know in Orlando, we worked a lot on retrofitting projects, highways to take out lanes, road diets or road lane repurposings, and to convert that extra space into cycle tracks, shared use paths, parallel parking if it was in districts that were more dense and more walkable. So that's very interesting, and I think that there are some opportunities with Jacksonville as we move forward with the Reconnecting Communities grants as they recycle to actually pull a lot of our highway projects into it. And Emerald Trail is another great example of a way I think that from a bike and ped perspective, the infrastructure can better connect communities. And but our challenge is going to be on the land use side. How do we put the policies in place that protect our neighborhoods, our most historically excluded and disenfranchised neighborhoods from becoming the next belt line in Atlanta, for example.
My point exactly.
And I mean, I think that the interplay as well between the state and local is really important. It's not been nearly as combative in Florida, from my understanding, as it is in other states where you have places like in Texas where in Houston and in Austin, like local officials are fighting the state very openly, and the state is saying we're going to use eminent domain regardless of what the city wants. And like we haven't had the same issues here, but in both Houston and Austin, they're continuing to build interstates and big highways through the cities, and local officials are fighting and losing those battles. And so how the State Department of Transportation also decides to apply for or use some of the changing policies from DOT and from the Reconnecting Communities grant or other incentives that are out there is going to be really important for Florida.
Yeah, and if anyone has any questions, just feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll answer them. But Andrew, just going back to you and that and kind of continue this conversation, I think about, again, I've been here, 18 years. I've seen a lot of change over the years, and I had an opportunity to work with the city of Jacksonville on the initial mobility fee, and which had a number of projects and funds that came out of that for bike ped and things of that nature. But a good example of the state and locals working together, I think, is that the Fuller Warren Bridge expansion. I had an opportunity to be on the front end of that, where that initial project, which is going to be a bigger bridge across the interstate. But FDOT, did work with the community, and now, pretty soon, it's been delayed a long time, but pretty soon there'll be this nice shared use path that will connect Riverside and San Marco together across the river. And, the same, people in the engineering world who were against that originally will probably be there on grand opening day, cutting the ribbon and taking awards once people pack that place for, the 4th of July, New Year's, for fireworks and all that. It's going to be a wonderful project, but it does show, what can happen when the state and local entities and communities work together.
Well, eventually, when they eventually work together, because Ennis, correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember there was a lot of fine working of language because the initial response from the state was, that it's illegal and not allowed to do a quote unquote bike path on an interstate bridge. And the issue was, this is not a bike path, it's a mixed use path or trail. Like the fine words was what matters. But at first, if I remember correctly, it was either the state or the city that kept insisting it's not legal to do a separate path. But it was because people were using the term bike path and the actual transportation term was mixed use. And it was some playing with the language to get an acknowledgement that this is allowed. Am I remembering this correctly? Because this was about a decade ago, the fight.
Yeah, at the time, I think we were still in the PPM, which is the plans prep manual in terms of design criteria the state was using. So, the language, I think it was, and again, it's been a minute now, but I think the language was physically separated barriers. That's what you need. So in essence, correct. You would not do like a bike lane on a limited access facility, which is an interstate highway, which I don't think anybody wants to be on a bike on the interstate highway. But the physical barrier is that concrete barrier between the fast moving traffic and the non-motorized traffic. And so, that was in the statutes at the time. South Florida, Miami, Orlando, Tampa, they all had built examples of this, or there was a precedent set. And, since that time, the policies have changed. And so, I'll put it this way. When I first went to FDOT, I remember we'd sit in meetings, and every project I had to go in, and if it's a resurfacing project, I had to go in and say, you can resize the width of these auto lanes, or take a lane out to put in a bike lane, or don't put in 4 feet, put in like 6 or 7 because you had the space. Or we were resurfacing the street and you put no crosswalks at the intersection. Like, why do we have 7 lanes, no crosswalks? And that was a conversation on every project that kind of came across my plate at that point in time. But by the time I left, we didn't even have to have those conversations anymore. like the engineers, the consultants that work on those projects, they were just putting those things in already. And even internally, I know in FDOT down in District 5, we even had to have conversations where the state was a bit more progressive than some of the communities in different counties. And even we had to walk things back because some communities like, no, we don't want that. It's like, well, but your safety conditions say this, but so there's a lot of give and take there, but it has been a very rewarding, I would say, experience to see how FDOT has changed. And because their policies have changed, we're now seeing that trickle down into a lot of the local municipalities. Jacksonville itself, Jacksonville's policies have changed a lot in the last 10 years as well. And so a lot of the new, even, roadway projects are being designed to accommodate, multiple forms of transportation. And really, at the end of the day, within the urban core area, if you're talking about downtown and vibrancy of that nature, the best type of transportation is on foot. So how can you create this environment to where you don't have to take the train or the U2C or the bus or get in the car? Chicago's a great example of that, where you can live all facets, all phases of your life within a 2 or 3 mile radius in some of the neighborhoods. So a lot of that also, deals a lot with our land use policies as well.
Yeah, and also that was true in Jacksonville, 50 years ago. It was, we can look at like cities today, but also just looking at Jacksonville's past, how dense the city used to be when you go to the pre-interstate days of the city with a very dense population that lived close together, and you had everything you needed close by.
So I do have one question for you. So you showed that you had a map. I think you might have answered the question in the chat already about posting the graph that showed Jacksonville as having the second largest African-American population behind Philly. In your opinion, what is the reason that you believe there's not a lot of African-American representation in decision-making locally when African-Americans make up a third of the population?
Yeah, I think this goes to a lot of the redistricting conversation that I've been having, a lot of the reporting, which has been really historic, starting in the 1980s and then ramping up in the 90s, were redistricting decisions in Jacksonville that were based on misinformation. There was case law that was out there that was misinterpreted, which locally public officials and specifically the Black elected officials in city council believed required certain districts to be at least 65% Black. Over time, that was reduced to 60%, but doing that, I think, just had this significant impact of limiting the voice of Black residents to only a few districts on city council, never enough where they make up a real sizable influence. And that has had a significant impact over the years. And then just politically, Jacksonville used to be a Democratic city where there were 2 Democratic parties. There was the white Democratic Party and the Black Democratic Party. And at that time, Black Democrats were very frequently locked out of citywide elections in the primary. And then when there was the realignment, which locally really happened in the 90s with Jeb Bush's election, at that time, a lot of people changing parties, it became a much more Republican city. And, since then, we only have had Alvin Brown elected and as a Democrat. And I think as a result of that, there's less Black voters who are voting Republican, and they're less involved in, I think, the policy making when you have partisan politics at a local level. Many other cities either are nonpartisan or they tend to be more Democratic leaning. And so I think the Black influence tends to be higher because of their influence in a primary nominating process or just as a part of the electorate. Even though they're larger here, the Black population is not able to achieve the same sort of, I think, political and electoral influence, which has really impacted. And then again, just going back to the redistricting conversation, like you rely on these district council members to know their neighborhoods. And for decades, our districts have not reflected neighborhoods. We used to have a district that went all the way from Baldwin to Mayport, that just like spanned, and it was the white district that was picking up all the outer parts of the city where white people live and carving out. And, we used to have, districts that were frequently crossing the river. Where I live right now used to be connected to Lackawanna and Mixontown because the Wolfson High School Powers Avenue area had Black residents living there. And so connecting that with every Black resident getting carved up, which means if you're the council member representing these seats, and the same thing was true for Arlington, which used to be connected with, downtown and Springfield, you don't have council members who really can know their neighborhoods, because how can they know when they've got a third of a neighborhood here, a quarter of a neighborhood there, half a neighborhood here, and they've got, so many of them. And so that really has diminished, I think the influence and the ability of people to speak up on behalf of Grant Park or, as a more urban neighborhood, or Sherwood Forest as a more suburban neighborhood. 103rd, I think of, and, Collins Road and like, Normandy neighborhoods that are often overlooked or not even thought of when we're talking about Black neighborhoods in Jacksonville, despite having large Black populations, because they get carved up so much into different districts. And I don't think you can blame the council members because, again, they are representing just such a small sliver of many of these neighborhoods. But the actual map itself makes it so that it's hard for those neighborhoods to organize and say, hey, Myrtle Avenue needs to be treated differently, or hey, this, north of the Trout River, like, needs to be treated differently, different areas of town. And I think that has really made a huge impact on the policymaking in Jacksonville. And I mean, this is not related to redistricting, but just one example for sometimes I think people, when they read about how long it can take different transportation projects, and the idea that you need all this public input can seem maddening. And, why do you need to do this? But a story I did years ago at the Times Union, I think, highlights just how important it is to actually know the community you're planning on behalf of, which was about this mother and daughter in Mandarin, where there's a large Orthodox population that all live together. You've got 3 synagogues within walking distance, which is important. You've got Chabad, Etz Chaim, and the Jacksonville Jewish Center. And they were walking on Yom Kippur to Etz Chaim, which means they were crossing San Jose, which was 8 lanes of traffic. And the way the walking signal worked at the time on San Jose was if you don't push the button, you don't get the walking signal. You can wait and wait for the lights to change, but when the light changes, you're only getting 11 seconds to cross those 8 lanes of traffic. And if you can't push the button because your religious beliefs, bar you from doing so on the Sabbath or on holy days, you're out of luck. And so in this case, a man who was partially blind drove into and killed the mother and severely hurt the daughter in this case. And there was a great response by public officials, including state legislators, and they immediately instituted a change which made things worse because the change continued to violate their religious laws, where it would automatically trigger the signal when they walked up, but the method it used was unkosher. And so now they had to walk around where the signal was pointed, which gave them even, more time, more distance to walk, and still just the 11 seconds. And eventually, after talking to the community and learning what would be a solution that would work, and having the timed walking signals come on, they were able to figure out a solution. But that was an example of life or death in transportation planning decisions because they were not considering the actual community affected. And in the area, and just how much, I mean, if you ever travel in Mandarin on Sabbath, you'll see, you know, the people crossing the roads and how, you know, dangerous it can look, because it is a lot of lanes of traffic that you're crossing, and how important it is to actually involve the people affected, or else you may be, you know, in that case, violating religious laws and the, you know, solutions that you're implementing. One of the questions was, what year was this? This was, I want to say about 2014, or 2013, 2014, 2015, thereabouts, that this happened. I'll see if I can pull up one of the stories I did at the time, and I'll share it in the chat.
You know, you bring up a very, you know, interesting point about transportation planning and the community. And, you know, there's been lots of demographic shifts and changes within our community, even in the last 10 years, and they're continuing. This is so, our history has so much been involved around white and Black, for example. Yet we have a very diverse community that's going into various neighborhoods that we don't even really talk about. You know, Normandy, for example, or University Boulevard, for example. Kentrice, I want to circle back to the City of Jacksonville Transportation Plan website that you talked about, because I think one of the challenging points in transportation planning is a lot of times, you know, there's conversations and the right people aren't in the room. You know, there may be people who don't know the culture of a community, or even how to integrate and connect with people within various neighborhoods and communities within the city. So could you explain a little bit more about that City of Jacksonville Transportation Plan website, kind of, you know, what is the purpose of it, and what is the long-term goal of it, and how people in the community can get better connected with that?
So sure, I have added in the chat the website address for you to go to. It's ventureoutjax.com. And so basically, it's an initiative from the City of Jacksonville to identify any issues that we may have with transportation infrastructure. So we talked about connectivity, we talked about mobility, we're talking about sidewalk improvements, we're talking about signal improvements. So literally ADA accessible issues that you may have, if that's a concern for you. Anything of that nature, we're pulling those items together through this survey or through this map that's on the website, and getting as much information from everybody as we can. So just to let you know, I'm pretty big on under-resourced. I don't like the word underserved. So I say under-resourced communities, because it's not all about serving them, right? It's about providing them with resources. So not only are we planning on pushing this website out that way, but we're also going into communities, knocking on doors, going to libraries, going to churches, going to different facilities, so that we can get that buy-in, or at least information, and educate the community that this is here, because those are the communities that have most of the infrastructure issues, let's be honest, right? So if you're living in Mandarin in a nicer neighborhood, you typically don't have sidewalk issues or flooding issues or any issues really outside of from an infrastructure perspective. So I think it's very important for us to make sure that we're reaching out to everyone for this particular project. So for those individuals that don't have internet access, we'll go to them, we'll create a survey, a paper survey for them to fill out, or even just have a conversation with them. But at the end of this, our hope is to pull together priority projects for the city to look at, to implement moving forward for the next budget cycles. So if there are flooding issues, we're also working with the City of Jacksonville on the resilience strategy for the city. And flooding is a huge part of that, looking at tributaries, looking at flooding areas, looking at infrastructure that's causing issues from that perspective, and kind of combining those things to kind of identify what some of the issues are in our town and our city that we can improve upon. So the first step is this website to get the information. Next phase, we'll keep the website up for probably about 6 months. And the next phase to categorize those issues that we find and that we hear from people, and then work through solutions as we move forward. So it's an ongoing, long-term process. It's not something that, of course, will happen next year, but it is giving us a better idea of where are the issues, where are the problems, where are the concerns, and what needs to be addressed pretty quickly.
Thank you for that. I got a follow-up question on that too.
Okay.
Because I know most people aren't going to understand the differences between like a city maintained road and like a state maintained road. So
Yeah.
I assume that people are going to, identify issues, and then those streets that aren't the cities that are responsible, like FDOTs, for example, the city would then coordinate with FDOT and try to go through the FDOT process.
Yes. It's interesting that you say that, because I don't think people realize that we have 3 entities here that own roads, right? We have the city of Jacksonville that owns some roads. We have FDOT that owns some roads, and JTA also owns some roads. And so it's interesting that you bring that up, because a lot of people don't have the understanding of what DOT's role is, even though they are changing in the way in which they think about things. Their job is to move traffic, right? And on our city streets, our city roads, it's more about that context sensitivity and that complete streets, alternatives, as well as I think JTA is thinking too a lot through the context sensitive streets and the connectivity and making sure roads aren't just for cars. So, this is an opportunity to educate folks on that. If they didn't know that, now you know that there are 3 different entities that run our roads and even our sidewalks. So it's something to think through. And that's why I think it's just so significantly important. We also have North Florida TPO, right? That's doing things too. So, I think that's why it's so important from a high standard standpoint of our local agencies working closely together to ensure that we are truly doing what's best for the city of Jacksonville. So that's a whole nother topic of conversation. We might have to do another program for that topic, because they don't like talking to each other very much, but we've got to kind of work through that. We've got to work through those personalities to ensure that we are working together. Because of course, like even with U2C, the ultimate urban circulator, that is everybody has to be connected in that. Every single person, every single agency has to be connected with that to make sure we are doing what's right for the community. So yes, we'll take those efforts and that information that we get from the website that are related to JTA and that are related even to the resilience project, because we have flooding as one of the topics, we'll share that information with that city department, as well as those other organizations too.
And it's a complex topic, but it's also a very important topic. I can tell you how many times I've worked with communities in the past, and the meetings will start off like the city needs to do this, the city needs to do that, and then I kind of raise my hands like that's not a city street. So,
right.
You talk to the wrong people like that. But for those you may not know, I mean, Catrice has perfectly stated already. The state's purpose is to move traffic on its streets. So the design criteria, what the state does, and the way the state invests in various facilities is a very different approach. It's that approach that when you want that Amazon package delivered on the same day, the infrastructure has to be in place to get it there. And that's kind of what the state's role has been focusing on. The challenge is just when you're trying to resolve a regional mobility situation into a neighborhood and how those interact with one another.
And we're such a large city that, that, like you mentioned earlier, there have been a couple different proposed options for that first mile, last mile. Once you get off the bus stop that stops, say, for example, on San Jose, and you live on Emory Circle, which is, 2 miles in from San Jose, and you have your groceries and you're trying to get off the bus and carry your groceries, that's just not going to work, right? So, we have to think through things like that. Many of us that are on this call have access to a vehicle. we're able to get in our vehicle and go wherever we want, whenever we want. But a lot of people don't have that luxury, right? And so when we're making decisions in regards to transit and transportation, those are the individuals that we need to think about. Those are the things that we need to think through and think about. We've got, several areas in Jacksonville that are considered food deserts, right? And so people don't have access to fresh fruits, vegetables, and meat. And so when they get on a bus and they have their ice cream or their milk, and it takes them an hour and a half to get home, that's not a good thing, right? So just thinking through how other people are affected by what we do when we're making decisions and policies are changing and roads are being built, or roads are being built to divide communities. Unfortunately, that's happened. And I think just thinking through and talking to one another will significantly help us kind of resolve some of those issues. Not tomorrow. We want all these great things to happen. It's not going to happen tomorrow. So we have to be realistic about timing, and that it takes time for things to happen. It takes years for things to happen. But the beautiful thing about what's happening in Jacksonville is that we're having these conversations, and these things are actually going to happen over the next maybe 10 years, I would say. So I think we're in a good place. We're not Miami. I don't think we want to be. I think we want to be Jacksonville, and we just have to be uniquely who we are and identify the ways in which we can do the things we need to do to make us be uniquely Jacksonville.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So we're getting close to our ending time. So I'm going to give everybody, another chance. If you have any additional questions that you would like our panelists to answer while we still have them with us, feel free to just drop those in the chat or Q&A box. In the meantime, I'm going to turn back to you, Kentrice, and Andrew as well. And if there are any closing comments that either you would like to make.
Andrew's so dynamic, so I'll go first and let him wrap things up. So I just would ask everybody to take a look at the website that I've put in the chat, go through it and add your comments, and please share with anybody who lives in Duval County. Also, what I'm going to do is also put my personal email in the chat too, because of some of the other projects that I mentioned that we're working on. If you have a level of interest in understanding any more about those projects, I'll be glad to share that information with you. So I'm just going to go ahead and put my email address in the chat. And Ennis, thank you for the opportunity to do this. This has been very valuable. I think we need to have more of these conversations. So I'm always open and available to have these conversations when you're ready. So thank you everyone for being here, and very nice to meet everyone. I'll put my email in the chat.
Yeah, thank you, Ennis, for letting me join as well. And thank you, Kentrice. I'm really excited about the interactive map, and I've already got in my mind about a half dozen comments I want to start adding in. So I'll close with also advocating that people do use that tool that's out there to have more of a voice in the planning process, and also to be aware that 2023 is going to be a really transformative year for Jacksonville. With these elections, because we have a term limited mayor. So there's going to be a new mayor and a new city council that takes over. And so for people who care about transportation issues and who want to elevate their neighborhood concerns, now is the time to really do that. And so to organize with your neighbors and figure out what are the issues you most want to highlight, because this is the time when people are going to be paying attention. It's not often that politicians have to pay attention to the people, but election years are one of those times. So I would just close by advocating that people who do care about transportation and infrastructure in Jacksonville as we continue to grow, and also Ennis and I both are obsessed with land use. And so if you care about land use and zoning as well, both knowing that there is some reforms that are already being pushed through, including the ability to do accessory dwelling units and more that people have been pushing for, using this time to make your voices heard by the people who do have political power right now.
I do appreciate you two coming on. I won't say too much about this. I'm just learning about this myself, and I need to jump in and look at the policies myself, but We have a 2045 comprehensive plan that's going to be coming out, pretty soon. And the city does have some of that draft information up on this website. I will try to find that information and connect with DuPont so they can include a link out to everyone who is interested in digging through policy and potential zoning regulations and classifications, things of that nature. But with that said, this event is the 5th of 6 virtual discussions we have planned for this year for the 2 Centuries of Jacksonville series, which is co-produced between the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and myself for the Jaxson magazine. The first events of this year were the African-American cemeteries, the benefits of blue zones, placemaking vs placekeeping, and most recently, the impacts of consolidation. Those events were held in February, April, June, and September of this year. If you missed them and are interested in any of those topics, we do have recordings available. I believe those recordings are on DuPont's website. Our 6th event, which is going to be focusing around trails and parks, will be hosted virtually on December the 8th. So we love to have you join us for that. So stay tuned for more details by following DuPont as well as the Jaxson Mag on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And in closing, I just want to thank again both of you, Cantrice and Andrew, for hopping on the call today, as well as all of our panelists for spending your lunch with us today. And so I just wish you a good afternoon and a good rest of the week. Have a nice day.
Thank you.